The highest court in the land is now looking into overturning Hawaii's strict gun laws.
The ruling could jeopardize similar laws in 5 other states.
This case could reshape how far states can restrict your right to carry and where.
The law the Supreme Court justices have their eye on is one that prevents people from carrying guns in certain public places.
There's a legal case moving through the American judicial system right now that legal experts are calling one of the most consequential Second Amendment challenges in decades. And the Supreme Court just did something highly unusual. They agreed to review it before lower courts even finish their work. This almost never happens. The court typically waits for complete trials, final rulings, and exhausted appeals before stepping in. But with Wolford versus Lopez, the justices broke their own traditional process and granted emergency review while the case was still at the preliminary injunction stage. The lawsuit originates from Hawaii, but constitutional scholars believe its impact could reshape carry regulations nationwide. At the center of the dispute is Hawaii's approach to firearms in public spaces, a framework that essentially reverses traditional legal assumptions by treating all public access private property as prohibited zones unless property owners explicitly grant permission. The state's law doesn't just require permits. It fundamentally inverts the burden of proof in ways that lower courts have disagreed about intensely. And now the Supreme Court is preparing to settle the question with a ruling that could invalidate similar restrictions across multiple states. What follows is an examination of why this case matters, how it reached the nation's highest court so quickly, what legal principles are at stake, and why the outcome could fundamentally alter the landscape of carry regulations from coast to coast. The rare emergency review that signals urgency. The Supreme Court's decision to grant review at this stage of litigation is extraordinarily uncommon and legally significant. Normally, the justices wait until cases have moved through complete trial proceedings and all appellate options have been exhausted. The standard process involves district court rulings, circuit court appeals, and only then, if the court chooses to hear the case at all, Supreme Court review. But Wolford versus Lopez didn't follow that path. The court granted certiorari while the case remained at the preliminary injunction phase before any final judgment had been rendered by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. This procedural departure from normal practice sends a clear signal that the justices believe there's an urgent constitutional issue requiring immediate attention. Legal analysts suggest this move indicates the court sees fundamental problems with how lower courts are interpreting recent precedent. By stepping in early, the justices are positioning themselves to establish a national standard without waiting years for the typical appellate process to conclude. It's a strong indication that the court believes Second Amendment principles are being undermined and that swift clarification is necessary. The legal framework that flips traditional assumptions. At the heart of this case is Hawaii's approach to regulating firearms in spaces that are privately owned but open to public access, places like shopping centers, restaurants, office buildings, and similar locations. Hawaii's law treats all such spaces as prohibited zones by default, requiring explicit permission from property owners before lawful carry is permitted. This represents a fundamental inversion of traditional legal assumptions. For centuries, American legal tradition has operated on the principle that citizens are free to act unless specifically prohibited. Hawaii's framework reverses that. It assumes prohibition unless explicit permission is granted. Even individuals who have obtained permits and passed background checks are treated as unauthorized unless they can prove they received specific consent from every property owner. The practical effect is that virtually all public access private property becomes off limits to permit holders. A person carrying lawfully could enter a store, restaurant, or shopping center and be committing a violation unless that specific business had posted signage or provided verbal authorization. The law doesn't require property owners to post prohibition notices. Instead, it requires them to post permission notices, a subtle but legally significant distinction. The district court initially found this framework unconstitutional and issued a preliminary injunction blocking enforcement, but the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that decision, allowing Hawaii's restrictions to take effect again. That reversal triggered the emergency appeal to the Supreme Court, the federal government's unexpected position. In a development that surprised many legal observers, the Department of Justice filed a brief siding with the challengers rather than defending Hawaii's regulatory approach. This represents an unusual stance for the federal government, which typically defers to state sovereignty in matters of local law enforcement. The DOJ's brief argued that Hawaii's framework goes beyond what the Second Amendment permits and conflicts with the Supreme Court's own precedent, established in the 2022 Bruen decision. The department explicitly stated that the prohibition-by-default approach undermines the right to carry for self-defense and warned that lawful public carry cannot be outlawed by default. This federal position significantly weakened Hawaii's legal standing when the Department of Justice, which typically supports state authority to regulate public safety, refuses to defend a state's restrictions and instead argues they're unconstitutional. It removes a key pillar of the state's defense strategy. The DOJ's involvement gave the challengers substantial credibility and helped push the Supreme Court toward accepting the case for review, the circuit split creating legal chaos. One of the primary reasons the Supreme Court accepts cases is to resolve conflicts between different federal circuit courts. When circuits issue contradictory rulings on the same constitutional question, it creates a situation where rights depend entirely on geography, exactly the kind of inconsistency the Supreme Court exists to resolve. The Ninth Circuit upheld Hawaii's carry restrictions, finding them constitutionally permissible, but the Third Circuit, reviewing similar regulatory frameworks, reached the opposite conclusion and struck down comparable restrictions as unconstitutional. This direct conflict affects millions of Americans living in states within those different circuits, where identical conduct might be protected in one jurisdiction but prohibited in another. The Constitution cannot mean different things in different regions of the country. When circuit courts disagree on fundamental constitutional questions, the Supreme Court must step in to establish uniform interpretation. By granting review in Wolford versus Lopez, the justices are moving to resolve this split and create consistency across federal jurisdictions. Hawaii's contradictory legal strategy. When the Supreme Court first indicated interest in reviewing the case, Hawaii requested a delay, arguing that additional fact-finding and trial proceedings were necessary before the constitutional questions could be properly decided. The state claimed the case was premature for Supreme Court review, but Hawaii's own previous statements undermined this argument. In earlier briefings to the Ninth Circuit, the state's attorneys had explicitly told judges that no additional facts needed to be developed and that the issues were purely constitutional questions of law requiring no further evidentiary hearings. Hawaii had argued the case was ready for final determination at the appellate level. This contradiction significantly damaged Hawaii's credibility before the Supreme Court. The state couldn't simultaneously argue that the case required more factual development while having previously claimed it was purely a legal matter ready for resolution. The justices recognized this inconsistency, and it helped justify proceeding with emergency review despite Hawaii's objections. The historical standard that changes everything. Everything in Wolford versus Lopez connects back to the Supreme Court's 2022 decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen. That landmark ruling fundamentally changed how Second Amendment cases must be analyzed by establishing that firearm regulations must align with historical tradition, not modern policy preferences. Bruen rejected the interest-balancing tests that many lower courts had been using, which allowed judges to weigh Second Amendment rights against governmental interests and public safety. Instead, the court held that regulations must be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. If a modern restriction lacks historical precedent from the founding era or the period immediately following the 14th Amendment's ratification, it's presumptively unconstitutional. The Wolford case will require the Supreme Court to apply this historical standard to Hawaii's prohibition-by-default framework. The district court that initially blocked Hawaii's law found no historical precedent for assuming criminality and requiring citizens to obtain explicit permission before exercising constitutional rights. The Supreme Court will now decide whether that analysis was correct and possibly expand on how the Bruen standard applies to similar restrictions. The message to lower courts. While the immediate question in Wolford involves Hawaii's specific regulations, many legal observers believe the Supreme Court has a secondary objective, reinforcing its authority over lower courts that have been resisting Bruen's clear directives. Since the 2022 decision, numerous federal judges have continued applying the old interest-balancing tests or finding creative ways to uphold restrictions despite the new historical standard. The Ninth Circuit's decision upholding Hawaii's near-total prohibition on public carry represents exactly the kind of resistance the Supreme Court may want to address. By accepting this case for emergency review and potentially issuing a strong ruling against Hawaii's approach, the justices would send an unmistakable message to all lower courts about compliance with established precedent. If the court's opinion includes particularly emphatic language about adherence to Bruen's methodology, it could reset how federal judges across the country approach Second Amendment cases. It would make it significantly more difficult for judges philosophically opposed to expansive Second Amendment protections to find legal justifications for upholding restrictive regulations. The implications extending beyond Hawaii. Though Wolford directly challenges only Hawaii's specific regulatory framework, the Supreme Court's ruling will have implications far beyond that single state. Multiple jurisdictions have implemented similar prohibition-by-default approaches or maintain permit systems that function comparably to Hawaii's restrictions. States including New York, California, New Jersey, and Maryland maintain regulatory frameworks that could be vulnerable if the Supreme Court rules broadly against Hawaii's approach. May issue permit systems where authorities have discretion to deny permits even to qualified applicants might not survive such a ruling. Restrictions that treat all public access private property as prohibited zones by default could be struck down nationwide. The court has deliberately limited its review to one specific question about carrying on private property open to public access. This focused approach allows the justices to issue a precise ruling without necessarily addressing every aspect of state carry regulations. But depending on how broadly the opinion is written, similar laws in other states could fall even without being directly challenged. So here's where this case actually stands as it moves towards Supreme Court review. The justices have taken the highly unusual step of granting emergency review before lower courts completed their work, signaling they see urgent constitutional problems requiring immediate attention. Hawaii's prohibition-by-default framework, which treats all public access private property as off-limits unless property owners explicitly grant permission, represents a fundamental inversion of traditional legal principles that lower courts have disagreed about intensely. The Department of Justice took the unexpected position of arguing against Hawaii's restrictions rather than defending state regulatory authority. Circuit courts have issued contradictory rulings, creating legal chaos where identical conduct is protected in some jurisdictions but prohibited in others. And Hawaii's own contradictory litigation strategy damaged its credibility before the nation's highest court. The case will require the Supreme Court to apply the historical standard established in Bruen to Hawaii's modern restrictions, potentially clarifying how that precedent applies to similar regulations nationwide. If the justices rule against Hawaii with strongly worded reasoning, the decision could invalidate comparable restrictions across multiple states and send a clear message to lower courts about compliance with established Second Amendment jurisprudence. Briefings will proceed, oral arguments will follow, and a ruling could emerge within months that fundamentally reshapes the landscape of carry regulations across America.